She didn't see it coming. Margaret Bennett, a wealthy 60-year-old lady who had spent her life pursuing her aspirations, believed she had discovered real love. It was surprising that a young guy with an enticing charm swept her off her feet and into the promise of a fresh start. But within 2 days of saying "I do," that promise became tragic. What if the person you trusted most in the world, the one who held your hand and murmured promises of eternity, was secretly planning your demise? And what if the same individual has done it all previously and planned to do it again? Welcome to Unseen True Crime Stories Headquarters. I appreciate you, my viewers, and particularly my subscribers, for your continued support as we strive to improve and offer you new and untold real crime tales every day. Please do not forget to subscribe to this channel. Margaret Bennett, 60, was once a corporate titan. For decades, her life centered around her firm, where she dedicated all of her energy, creativity, and attention. She developed her business from the bottom up, relishing on late hours, smart choices, and the pleasure of each hard-earned victory. Her work ethic was unwavering, and her ambition was boundless. However, as her career developed, her personal life faded. Her marriage crumbled over time, a result of the long hours and emotional distance that came with the demands of operating a successful business. By the time her divorce was official, she was left with a void that no amount of financial success could fill. With her business behind her, Margaret found herself in strange territory: retirement. Despite her financial prosperity and comfortable lifestyle, she felt oddly adrift, haunted by a loneliness that had deepened with time. She discovered that, other from the odd visit from her children and a few close friends, she had no one to share her daily life with. Holidays were often quiet, spent alone in her vast, echoing home. The busy life she previously knew had disappeared, leaving her with a solitude that grew louder with each passing year. Though she seldom expressed it, Margaret secretly desired company, someone who might restore warmth to her life and provide her with the basic joys of togetherness. Despite her longing, Margaret remained hesitant. She'd been injured before, and life had taught her to be watchful, particularly around males. Younger males, in particular, were outside her radar. She considered herself as an older lady, beyond the age when young passion or fresh love seemed normal. Dating someone younger seemed almost humiliating to her, something out of character that should be reserved for movies or books. Younger guys had sometimes given her attention, but she dismissed it, figuring they were either misinformed or interested in anything other than her company. Her integrity and self-respect kept her grounded, and she never allowed herself to fantasize of rekindling romance with someone much younger. She just did not view herself as capable or suitable for such a relationship. Then, unexpectedly, Margaret met Ethan Carter, the personification of charm and mystery. At 29, he embodied everything a confident young man should be: charming, attentive, and well-dressed. But Ethan's confidence was purposefully created, and he had a terrible background that he kept hidden behind his slick veneer. Born into a life of instability, he quickly realized that the world had nothing to offer him unless he seized it by force or deception. He had established a technique for targeting affluent, lonely, and vulnerable older women during the last 3 years. With each contact, Ethan presented a meticulously cultivated persona tailored to his current target's interests and vulnerabilities. Margaret, his next target, had no idea that Ethan had previously left a path of heartache, financial devastation, and even murder. He married 4 older ladies under various identities, each time taking on a new persona to prevent anybody from linking the links. And each of those marriages had ended in disaster, with Ethan leaving away richer but no wiser. To the outside world, he seemed to be a faithful, attentive young husband who was deeply committed to his wife. But behind closed doors, he was cold, calculating, and cruel, only concerned with the financial stability his targets offered. It was a breezy summer evening at a local community event, one of the fundraisers Margaret used to attend to keep socially engaged. She wasn't searching for romance, especially from a guy decades her younger. She hardly saw Ethan while sipping her wine and surveying the crowd. But Ethan spotted her. He observed her from across the room, noticing the calm elegance she exuded as well as the little clues of her inner existence, such as the way she politely laughed with acquaintances while seeming unconnected and lost in contemplation. She carried herself with elegance, yet he could see a tinge of loneliness in her eyes as she gazed about the room with a subtle need. Ethan's trained eye quickly recognized her as an ideal target. When Ethan approached, he was casual and disarming, and Margaret felt at ease within minutes. His remarks were kind, his tone courteous, and his manner as non-threatening as possible. He was cautious, aware that an overt expression of interest may turn her off. Instead, he made light conversation, interspersed with humor and attention. Margaret found herself enjoying the connection more than she had anticipated, amazed by how easy he was to chat to. He exuded a warmth and charm that she had not felt in years. Despite the first spark, Margaret remained skeptical. Part of her felt gratified, but she dismissed it, attributing his attention to mere friendship rather than true interest. But Ethan was prepared. He'd done this before and was excellent at persuading. Over the following 2 weeks, he attended numerous community functions, crossing paths with her in seemingly random yet well-planned ways. He learned more about her hobbies, her background, and her little eccentricities. He listened carefully to her comments and emotions, noticing what made her laugh, what made her uptight, and what relaxed her barriers. He found genuine ways to compliment her, which calmed her suspicions. Ethan was not overwhelming. Instead, he gave subtle reminders of his presence via modest, thoughtful acts that made an indelible impact. Margaret gradually let down her guard. Ethan would contact her late at night and engage her in lengthy, deep chats that lasted into the early hours. He inquired about her life, aspirations, and regrets. Margaret found herself revealing memories from her childhood, her dreams, the sacrifices she made for her company, and the loneliness that resulted. Every time she disclosed a part of herself, Ethan listened intently, making her feel cherished and understood. It was as if he was removing the layers she had placed around her heart, tearing down the barriers she had so carefully constructed. Ethan's attention was beyond words. He understood the power of tiny deeds. On an average day, he might bring her favorite tea while also surprise her with a nice message or a flower. He showed up with books he knew she'd like, listened to her comments on the characters and subjects, and interacted in ways that made her feel intellectually and emotionally valued. Margaret soon came to believe that she had met someone who actually understood her, someone who looked beyond her age and riches. Her uncertainty evaporated with each act of compassion, and she felt optimism for the first time in years. Ethan's presence filled her once empty house with laughter and camaraderie, turning her days into times of shared delight and warmth. Margaret, for the first time in decades, found herself succumbing to the charm and attraction of a guy who seemed to really care about her. And gradually, the barriers she'd built around her heart started to erode. But whereas Margaret saw simply the budding of a new love, Ethan saw something quite different. A door leading to a life of financial comfort, based on the trust and vulnerability of a woman who believed in him. For him, this romance was just another plot, a planned strategy to acquire access to Margaret's fortune. And as Margaret sank more under his spell, Ethan maintained his performance, knowing just when to push forward and when to draw back, with each action designed to drag her deeper into his clutches. Margaret knew she was taking a risk, but she told herself that it would be worthwhile. For the first time, she allowed herself to fantasize about a future filled with companionship and love, oblivious that beneath Ethan's warm smile and caring words was a guy who had no intention of honoring any promises he made. Behind every polite remark, sweet smile, and attentive gesture, Ethan's actual intentions became clear. Margaret had fallen for the guy she believed he was, but Ethan's actions were nothing more than a well-orchestrated display. He was a master of psychological manipulation, using Margaret's weaknesses as instruments. Ethan had carefully analyzed Margaret's emotional needs and vulnerabilities from the start, realizing that despite her financial and professional accomplishments, she craved true connection and a feeling of security. He targeted this need with care, knowing that appealing to her emotions would draw her further into his web. Ethan skillfully presented himself as a guy of limited resources, with basic interests and a plain attitude to life. He understood that any overt show of avarice or interest in her money would cause Margaret's defenses to rise. Instead, he concentrated on attributes that she would appreciate: humility, appreciation for her knowledge, and thankfulness for the little things in life. Ethan would frequently tell Margaret about his modest origins, carefully crafting scenarios that made her feel he had suffered but maintained his integrity. He showed genuine appreciation for her achievements, stressing how much he appreciated her life experiences and perspectives. To acquire her confidence, Ethan positioned himself as her rock, constantly listening to her problems and offering comfort. He became her confidant, urging her to express her deepest concerns and misgivings. When Margaret voiced concerns about her health or her distant ties with her children, Ethan quickly offered words of consolation, assuring her that he appreciated her courage and tenacity. He never pushed her too far, always striking the ideal balance between attentive and inconspicuous. By making her feel emotionally supported, he established a dependence that enabled him to dictate the pace of the relationship and strengthen her trust. With Margaret's confidence established, Ethan gradually shifted his focus to her money. He understood he needed to tread cautiously. Margaret was no fool when it came to money. She was a self-made lady who had controlled her riches for decades, and any obvious efforts to access her cash may arouse suspicion. So Ethan took his time, gradually sowing seeds that would enable him to seize control while raising no red flags. He started by providing her basic financial advice under the premise of assisting her in simplifying her retirement lifestyle. He would gently say that she deserved to enjoy her achievement and might think about concentrating her assets for peace of mind. As their relationship got increasingly serious, Ethan began to explore future plans. He made it seem like he was entirely dedicated to a life with her, discussing long-term objectives and establishing a future together. He advised they make choices as a group, which sparked discussions about estate planning, insurance, and other financial issues. Ethan gently intimated that Margaret might consider designating him the beneficiary of her fortune, since they were now starting a life together. He presented it as a practical step, a statement of their commitment to one another. Margaret, engrossed in the concept of a common future, started to see the logic in his recommendations. She had no close family members to help financially, so she started making modifications to her estate with Ethan's urging. Ethan was gradually included into her life insurance policies and financial plans, guaranteeing that he inherited her riches. Each step was meticulously planned, and Ethan provided just the appropriate amount of encouragement and tenderness to make her feel at ease with her selections. Unbeknownst to Margaret, Ethan's motives were not genuine. She wasn't his first target, and she was unlikely to be his last. Over the course of 3 years, Ethan had mastered a strategy that he reproduced precisely. His strategy was consistent. He would research his target, enter her life with patience and charm, and gradually integrate himself into her finances. Once his name appeared on the proper paperwork, the relationship took a sharp turn. Margaret was the sixth lady Ethan had snared in this fashion. The 4 women who came before her had eerily similar profiles. Each had fallen under his spell, only to find themselves alone and impoverished. Some were divorced, some widowed. All were financially well and lacked a close family to protect them. Each marriage ended in a fatal event for his spouse. Heart attacks, sudden illnesses, and unexpected falls took the lives of the previous 4 ladies. Ethan would come each time as a bereaved spouse, crushed by his loss, only to discreetly grab his fortune and vanish, moving on to the next city with a new identity and target. Margaret was oblivious of this sordid background, and Ethan made sure it remained that way. He was skilled at wiping traces of his past, employing aliases and made-up histories to keep each lady apart from his former existence. The only commonality in each instance was the pattern: a passionate courtship, a rapid marriage, and then, within weeks or months, his unexpected death, leaving him the only benefactor. This time, Ethan's plan was even more evil. He was aware Margaret had heart problems and was taking frequent medicine. While he had previously depended on accidents or unexpected illnesses, with Margaret, he saw a chance to speed up his strategy by leveraging her own health against her. Ethan proceeded to progressively mess with her medicine, changing her heart tablets with something safe but useless, knowing that this would eventually deteriorate her health. He kept up the loving spouse act while watching her health deteriorate with cold, calculating patience. His goal was to guarantee that when Margaret died, it would look to be a normal development of her health problems, leaving little room for authorities or family members to investigate. As Margaret weakened, Ethan continued to play the part of the loyal husband, keeping her unconscious of his betrayal. To everyone around them, he seemed to be her devoted companion, sticking by her side through her health issues. But behind closed doors, he was plotting her death with sickening indifference, waiting for the day when her fortune would be his. Ethan's plan was almost complete, and he had every reason to assume he would escape unhurt once again. But destiny had other ideas, and Ethan's dark past would soon come up with him in ways he never expected. Ethan's proposal caught Margaret off guard. Their relationship had progressed quickly, but Ethan's passion and warmth had persuaded her he was committed for the long haul. One tranquil evening, during dinner, he knelt before her and asked her to marry him. Margaret's immediate response was one of astonishment. She hadn't expected him to propose, especially so quickly. She was carried away by his remarks of a life together and how he couldn't picture his future without her. He constructed a vivid image of a connection based on love, camaraderie, and respect, giving her little time to reflect on her reservations. Margaret paused, feeling the weight of the choice before her. She was an elderly lady whose life had long been characterized by independence. Marriage was something she hadn't truly contemplated in years, and the prospect of saying yes sounded strange. In that moment, she expressed her worries, telling him that she couldn't give him children and that, at her age, she wasn't sure if she could play the part he may expect in a typical marriage. But, with perfect timing, Ethan reassured her that he merely wanted her company, that having a family was not his goal, and that she was enough for him. This emotional reaction alleviated her anxieties, and she started to feel that, after years of seclusion, this was her shot at happiness, one she didn't want to pass up. After what seemed like a lifetime, Margaret smiled, her heart full with cautious optimism, and decided to marry him. The wedding was modest and intimate, just as Ethan had expected. He assured her that he wanted something private, just the two of them. Margaret felt comforted and liked the simplicity. Ethan stated that he had no surviving relatives and told Margaret a hazy tale of catastrophic losses, which she accepted without question, viewing it as part of the reason he was attracted to her as a similar soul who had also experienced grief and loss. Only a few close acquaintances from Margaret's background attended the wedding, which took place in a small church. The mood was friendly but bittersweet, with Margaret feeling a combination of joy and lingering apprehension. But with Ethan's hand in hers, she disregarded her worries, convincing herself that this was the fresh start she had been looking for. Following the wedding, Ethan thoroughly embraced his role as the loving husband, methodically projecting an image of devotion and support. He entered Margaret's house, filling it with his presence, responding to her needs, and making her feel valued. He took on little housework, prepared her favorite meals, and even surprised her with breakfast in bed every morning. He welcomed her with a warm grin, inquiring about her plans and making her feel important. Margaret was enthralled by this new era of her life, and she relished the company she had long desired. In those early days, Ethan was always alert. He listened closely while Margaret talked, and he seemed genuinely interested in her pleasure. He urged her to relax, telling her that she deserved to enjoy her retirement after years of hard work. He treated her in little ways, bringing her favorite teas and books, and spending peaceful nights with. For the first time in years, Margaret felt as if she had a partner who understood her and would be there for her through thick and thin. She had no idea that Ethan's benevolence had a deliberate aim. His care was a show, with each gesture intended to strengthen her reliance on him. Behind the scenes, Ethan was putting his last plan into action. As he played the attentive spouse, he started to change Margaret's prescription, gradually replacing her heart drugs with safer alternatives. He proceeded slowly, making sure Margaret didn't notice any sudden changes in her routine. His purpose was to gradually deteriorate her health so that when the time came, her death would seem to be a terrible but natural occurrence. Ethan followed each step precisely, convinced that his method was infallible. Every day, he watched Margaret's health deteriorate gradually, feeling only joy as his plan came to fruition. 2 days after their marriage, the lovely veneer Ethan had built was destroyed in one instant. It happened over a calm evening supper at home. Margaret sat across from Ethan, talking about future plans and smiling at a story she'd just recounted. Ethan observed her with a serene look, sometimes nodding, but his mind was elsewhere, mentally counting down the minutes, waiting for the expected symptoms. Margaret's cheeks instantly became pale. She clutched her chest, perplexity and terror in her gaze. Ethan's expression showed worry, but he felt peaceful within. He got up, simulating alarm, rushed to her side, and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder as she gasped for air. She gasped, attempting to figure out what was going on, and looked to him for aid. Ethan, still playing the part of the concerned husband, swiftly dialed 911, his voice calm, but with a tinge of urgency that added to his impressive performance. While they waited for aid, Ethan maintained his act, mumbling words of consolation and comforting her that she would be all right, despite the fact that he knew precisely what was going on. When the paramedics came, he grabbed her hand firmly and followed them to the ambulance with all his love. Margaret's health quickly worsened while on the way to the hospital. Her breathing became shallower, and her grasp on his hand loosened. Ethan kept a worried expression, but he knew the conclusion was clear. By the time they arrived at the hospital, Margaret had died. Ethan put on a display of mourning, his mood a combination of astonishment and sorrow, convincing everyone around him. To the physicians and nurses, he was a sad husband who had just lost the love of his life. He stayed in the waiting room, head in his hands, countenance blank. But in his mind, he was already planning his next move. He was certain that within a few days, the proper paperwork would be completed, and he would inherit all Margaret had left behind. His ideas had once again proved successful. But Ethan was unaware that his meticulously constructed strategy would not go as well as he had hoped. Margaret's untimely death had left those closest to her with unanswered questions. And, as Ethan prepared to begin his new life, he realized that Margaret's narrative was far from ended, and the ramifications of his actions were closer than he could have imagined. Olivia Bennet had always been her mother's defender, even if Margaret didn't always see it that way. Olivia was in her late 20s when she decided to become a police officer, motivated by a quest for justice and a natural cynicism that served her well on the job. She was bright, instinctive, and had a strong sense of responsibility, which frequently carried over into her personal life, particularly with her family. While Olivia and her mother had drifted apart over the years, she still felt a tremendous feeling of responsibility for Margaret. She recognized that her mother's life had been full of sacrifices, and that Margaret's emphasis on her job had sometimes left little opportunity for intimate family relationships. Despite this, Olivia admired her mother's strength and independence, and she had always longed for Margaret to achieve true happiness. When Margaret introduced her to Ethan, Olivia's senses were instantly activated. She had always known her mother to be rational and careful, not easily swayed by love gestures, especially from someone so much younger. However, Ethan's charm seemed to have taken hold of Margaret in a manner that made Olivia nervous. She couldn't escape the sensation that something was wrong, but she kept her fears to herself, not wanting to hurt her mother or put a rift between them. Olivia reminded herself that Margaret deserved a shot at happiness, even if her decision seemed unorthodox. Olivia couldn't dismiss her nagging thoughts. Ethan's abrupt entrance in Margaret's life was too opportune, and his devotion was too deliberate. Olivia saw Ethan's excessively attentive conduct, which was his method of constantly being there, and just near enough to watch Margaret's relationships with others. Ethan's charisma was evident, but Olivia found it too prepared and polished. She saw an underlying manipulation in his words and behavior, even if Margaret was ignorant to it. Whenever she attempted to interrogate Ethan about his background or his family, he would sidestep, delivering vague answers that further added to her concerns. But, for Margaret's sake, Olivia suppressed her entire fears, preferring to watch and wait, hoping her instincts were incorrect. Olivia was devastated when Margaret died unexpectedly 2 days after the wedding. She couldn't understand how her mother, who seemed to be in good health despite her heart issue, could have died so suddenly. Her mother's death seemed too fast and definitive, and the circumstances left her troubled. As she went about coping with the aftermath, Olivia couldn't escape the notion that there was more to her mother's death than everyone was admitting. She saw Ethan's conduct in the hospital, as well as his controlled demonstrations of anguish and well-timed sighs of sorrow over the next several days. Most people assumed he was a heartbroken spouse, but Olivia saw his acts as a farce. Olivia chose to act on her intuition. She was aware that conducting an inquiry would strain her relationship with Ethan and may upset her mother's close friends, but her instincts told her that something was wrong. In her area of business, she had learned to trust her instincts, and this was no different. She immediately sought a toxicology report, intending to pursue every possible avenue. She was aware of the possibility of backlash. Her mother's death had been officially documented as natural, and her actions may seem invasive. But Olivia couldn't let her concerns go unanswered, even if it meant standing alone in her beliefs. Olivia's toxicological result marked a turning point. She was worried about the findings, hoping to find anything that would explain her mother's untimely death, but also fearing that she would discover something awful. When she saw the report, her doubts became irrefutable facts. According to the study, Margaret died as a result of an overdose of her heart medicine, which was substantially more than the authorized amount. Olivia felt a rush of anguish and wrath pour over her. She knew her mother well enough to feel certain that Margaret would never overdose by mistake. Margaret had always been quite cautious about her health habits. Olivia recognized that her mother's strict temperament eliminated any possibility of neglect. This overdose was not accidental. Olivia saw only one plausible explanation. Someone had tampered with her mother's medicine, and there was only one individual with both access and motive: Ethan. As Olivia struggled with this realization, she remembered every time Ethan had cared for Margaret, every meal he had prepared, and every apparently harmless gesture. She recalled how attentive he had been, how he had played the ideal part of the loving husband, even arranging Margaret's prescription with an eager grin. Olivia's heart sank as she understood that each gesture was most likely a premeditated step in a wider, diabolical scheme. She couldn't help but feel very saddened for her mother, who had unintentionally fallen into the clutches of a guy who showed no remorse. She contacted her mother's banker, who informed her of the adjustments her mother made previous to her death that designated her husband as the beneficiary of her funds after she died, including her life insurance. She could see the purpose right there. Olivia, now sure of Ethan's complicity in her mother's murder, was determined to expose the truth. However, feeling alone was insufficient. She wanted actual proof to hold Ethan responsible. Olivia launched a thorough inquiry into Ethan's history, drawing on her experience as a cop. She went back over every detail she could find, intending to create a strong case against him. Her inquiry took her through layers of identities, as Ethan went to great measures to hide his background and identity. But Olivia persisted, and the guy she believed was her mother's husband gradually transformed into a stranger with a trail of lies. Olivia's investigation revealed a troubling trend that chilled her to the core. In every location he had lived in, Ethan had left behind a trail of shattered lives focused on affluent older women who showed a striking likeness to her mother, financially independent, frequently alone, and longing for company. The parts of his history came together like a grim puzzle. She found that Ethan had changed his name many times and had been married 4 times. In each case, his marriages were elderly, rich ladies who died unexpectedly shortly after he became the principal benefactor of their fortunes. The pattern was clear. Ethan would infiltrate these women's lives, present a facade of love and devotion, and then use their weaknesses to obtain control of their money before organizing their murders. Olivia's resolve strengthened with every new piece of proof. She started to feel a strong feeling of responsibility, not just to her mother, but also to the other women who had fallen victim to Ethan's machinations. She knew that if she didn't intervene, Ethan would continue his ruse, moving on to other places, identities, and victims. Her mother's terrible death was no longer an isolated episode. It was part of a broader pattern of cruelty and manipulation. The thought of her mother becoming just another name in a list of victims was nearly terrible, but it spurred Olivia's determination. She was resolved to break Ethan's pattern of deception once and for all. Olivia came to a crossroads as the facts piled up. She realized, with awful certainty, that Ethan had never loved her mother. Everything he had done, from the first seduction to the lovely, attentive gestures, had been part of a premeditated plan to acquire control of Margaret's fortune. Her mother had been exploited, deceived, and eventually abandoned. The full force of Ethan's treachery struck Olivia like a tidal wave. This was more than simply a crime of passion or a single act of cruelty. It was a long-term manipulative scheme. Ethan's whole existence appeared to be based on the misery and exploitation of defenseless women, each of whom was drawn into his circle by the same enticing appeal that had first duped Margaret. Olivia's determination became stronger as she realized the extent of Ethan's influence. She couldn't bring her mother back, but she could ensure that Ethan faced punishment. Her heart felt heavy, but her head was clear. Her goal was not only to avenge her mother, but also to protect other women from experiencing the same fate. She knew the struggle ahead would be difficult. Ethan was an expert at hiding his tracks and avoiding suspicion, but Olivia had something he hadn't anticipated: a daughter's devotion and drive to pursue justice at any cost. Olivia collected every piece of information, every little hint that built a picture of Ethan's genuine personality. She gathered evidence, contacted police in the locations where he had previously resided, and contacted the relatives of his past victims. Her inquiry turned up tales hauntingly similar to her mother's: a passionate courtship, a hasty marriage, and a sudden and untimely death. Each one left Ethan wealthy and eager to go on to his next goal. Olivia, armed with the information, prepares to confront Ethan and reveal his dishonesty. She was no longer merely a heartbroken daughter. She was an investigator on a mission, determined to see justice done. Ethan's carefully crafted world started to collapse as he realized his independence was slipping away. The nearly imperceptible signs indicated him he was being observed, analyzed more intently than he had expected. He noted an increase in police enforcement presence in his area, discreet but pointed queries from acquaintances, and Olivia's eyes seemed to follow him whenever they crossed paths. Ethan's typical confidence was eroding, and for the first time, he felt compelled to run. He had previously fled, sliding out of lives and towns without leaving a trace, and he was convinced he could do it again. Determined to flee before authorities arrived, Ethan painstakingly planned his escape. He withdrew cash in modest quantities over many days, packed a small luggage, and deleted all traces of his online presence. He intended to flee under the cover of darkness, taking just the necessities and enough fake credentials to establish a new existence somewhere. Ethan imagined he could vanish once again and reappear in a new place to start over. But he didn't realize Olivia was already many steps ahead of him. Olivia had carefully notified the authorities to Ethan's whereabouts, anticipating his escape attempt. She knew his pattern, his propensity to go as soon as things became hot, and she wasn't ready to let him go again. She had gathered the necessary backing, including co-workers, and used her law enforcement ties to put him under tight monitoring. The authorities tracked his every step, waiting for the moment he'd make a run for it. Finally, that night came, and Ethan tried to flee town, resulting in a spectacular pursuit. The streets were lighted up with sirens as police enforcement cars chased him, the sound booming through the silent night as he twisted across the city in a frantic search for escape. But Olivia's careful plotting paid off, and after a tense chase, Ethan was arrested, his last effort to flee foiled. When Ethan was apprehended, he maintained a look of steely defiance, seeking to retain control despite his captivity. He was taken in handcuffs, his customary charm and calm replaced with a sullen wrath. Olivia watched from a distance, her eyes narrowed with repressed rage as she focused on the man who had caused so much suffering to her mother and others like her. Olivia felt a wave of mixed feelings as she stood across from him. Sadness, fury, and a bittersweet pleasure that justice was now within grasp. Ethan returned her stare, his countenance devoid of regret, as if challenging her to go with the trial. But Olivia remained firm, her expression stern, determined to bring him down not just for her mother, but for every woman he had misled, twisted, and left broken in his wake. This encounter was short, with one dramatic moment of silence that screamed more than words. Olivia was determined to see this through to the conclusion, ensuring that Ethan faced the full repercussions of his conduct. No more aliases or escapes. This time, he would confront the truth in front of everyone he had harmed. The trial that followed was nothing short of captivating. Ethan, ever the actor, attempted to retain an appearance of innocence by portraying himself as a sad widower wrongly convicted. In his opening comments, he painted himself as the victim of a terrible misunderstanding, saying that his love for Margaret was real and that her death was only a heartbreaking accident. He spoke with studied grief, his voice low and calm, attempting to persuade the jury with his well-produced demeanor. But the prosecution was unrelenting, presenting a case that would gradually demolish Ethan's web of falsehoods. Olivia was there every day of the trial, a continuous reminder of the lives Ethan had devastated. She listened as prosecutors presented the devastating evidence she had worked so hard to uncover: the toxicology report, the modified will, and the fake signatures that pointed to his planned scam. They disclosed how he acquired access to Margaret's prescription and altered it to give the appearance of a gradual decline. The court remained mute as these disclosures were presented, with each piece of evidence throwing a heavier shadow on Ethan's claims of innocence. However, Margaret's narrative was not the only one that filled the courtroom. As the trial continued, the relatives of Ethan's earlier victims spoke out, each with a story that paralleled Margaret's awful destiny. Mothers, children, and sisters of his past spouses described the pain they had experienced, the dubious circumstances under which their loved ones had died, and the strange commonalities that linked each case. Testimonies from these families painted a chilling portrait of Ethan's pattern of manipulation, with each story confirming Olivia's disturbing discovery. Women who, like Margaret, had believed in Ethan's love only to be used, discarded, and abandoned as collateral in his ruthless pursuit of wealth. Ethan tried to remain calm, but as each witness talked, the facade started to break. The testimony of these families had a great effect on the jury, who saw firsthand the emotional devastation left in Ethan's aftermath. The prosecution stressed his cold calculating, his ability to alter himself into whatever identity each victim required, only to deprive them of their dignity, riches, and eventually their lives. The prosecution gradually destroyed Ethan's argument, demonstrating his history of lying and emphasizing the psychological manipulation he used to trap his victims. In a final blow, the prosecution produced evidence of Ethan's aliases, illustrating how he used many identities, changed names, and manufactured pasts to avoid detection. The courtroom went quiet as each pseudonym was read out, each identity a haunting reminder of a life he had destroyed. The gravity of his deeds lingered in the air, and for the first time, Ethan's composure wavered. The carefully crafted facade of innocence gave way to glimpses of the cold, calculating guy who had spent years honing the art of deceit. The trial culminated with closing comments that left the jurors in little question about Ethan's intentions. The prosecution made one more pitch to justice, stressing the need of preventing others from falling prey to his tactics. The relatives of his victims waited to see whether the system would finally put an end to the misery they had undergone. And when the jury returned with their judgment, Olivia felt a sense of peace and closure, knowing that her mother's and so many others' voices had been heard. Ethan was found guilty on many counts, each representing the lives he had killed and the trust he had violated. His effort to run, his numerous fabrications, and his recurrent patterns of deception had all culminated in this moment. Olivia knew her mother's legacy would not end in quiet, nor would it be soiled by the falsehoods Ethan had said. Margaret's legacy, on the other hand, would serve as a testimony to perseverance and justice, a reminder that truth triumphs even in the most sinister plans. And as Ethan was carried away, Olivia finally allowed herself to weep, knowing that her battle had resulted in the justice her mother and so many others deserved. The day of her sentence was a watershed event for Olivia. After months of inquiry, trial, and passionate courtroom testimony, justice was finally served. Ethan was condemned to life in prison with no chance of parole, guaranteeing that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars, unable to hurt others or continue his cycle of manipulation and lies. His life of deception, deceit, and greed had come to an end, replaced with a jail term proportionate to the gravity of his actions. Olivia felt a weight lift off her shoulders as she saw him lead away, a sensation she hadn't experienced since her mother's death. Margaret's tragic death had originally looked like a never-ending tragedy, but now that Ethan was finally facing the repercussions, Olivia felt a little but considerable sense of relief. Olivia understood that this was about more than simply punishing Ethan. It was also about honoring Margaret's legacy. Her mother's legacy would not be harmed by Ethan's deception. Instead, Margaret would be regarded as a strong, self-sufficient lady who reared a daughter eager to battle for her. Ethan's sentence was more than simply punishment. It was a demonstration of perseverance, fortitude, and the quest of truth. Olivia sensed her mother's presence with her, as if Margaret was finally at ease, knowing that her narrative would be one of justice rather than treachery. As she pondered on the months that had passed, Olivia couldn't help but consider the larger consequences of Ethan's conduct. He hadn't only targeted her mother. He had preyed on a common vulnerability: loneliness, a need for connection, and a need for company. Ethan had taken advantage of these demands, manipulating and destroying people's lives for selfish gain. Olivia reflected on the numerous women, including Margaret, who had been duped by persons who viewed their compassion and charity as flaws to exploit. This excursion had shown Olivia the brutal truth of how people like Ethan work, infiltrating people's lives and exploiting their trust. She recognized how important it was for people to be aware of these risks and spot the symptoms of manipulation and deception before it was too late. Her mother's experience had taught her the value of attentiveness and the necessity to see past words and appearances. Olivia hoped that Margaret's tale would teach people to be careful and to heed their instincts, especially when emotions were running high. She wanted people to learn from her mother's tragedy and realize the need of self-defense, particularly in a world with predators like Ethan. Olivia took comfort in knowing that by bringing Ethan to justice, she had not only avenged her mother, but also taken a step in protecting future prospective victims. She hoped that after hearing Margaret's tale, people would think carefully about giving their lives to someone they hardly knew. She encouraged people to identify the symptoms of deception and avoid those who appeared too good to be true. Margaret's legacy would serve as a beacon of awareness, telling people to be cautious with their trust and to prioritize their own self-worth above anyone's claims of love or devotion. As the narrative of Margaret's life and Ethan's demise concludes, we are left with critical issues that have far-reaching implications. How well do we know the individuals closest to us? Is it possible to discover a hidden intention in someone we love? Would we recognize symptoms of manipulation if they were there in front of us? These concerns are important considering because they remind us to keep watchful, follow our instincts, and ensure that we are protecting ourselves and our loved ones. Margaret's experience serves as a compelling reminder of the need of awareness in relationships, as well as the significance of protecting our hearts and thoughts. If you like this story, please subscribe to get more true life experiences that prompt thought and conversation. Thank you for joining us on this path toward justice and resilience.